Guys, this is Rudy coming at you live from Palm Beach in Florida. What I want to do is take a few minutes and share a story with you. This is a book by Boone Pickens. As you can see, the book is quite old. I've had it for a long, long time, right? The first billion is the hardest. But up here, you can see with the plan to reduce U.S. oil energy independence. On the front of the flap, it also says reflections of a life of comebacks in America's energy future. Boone Pickens was one of those original sort of oil guys in terms of investors. And he made a lot of money on energy stocks. And it helped that he started out in the 80s. But what I want to do is just share a few of the points with you, because what I want to do with this video is just illustrate the difference between someone who's investing for the long term and someone who might be day trading or getting in and out of stocks, which is never a good idea because it's very difficult to time the market. In fact, people always say time in the market is much better than trying to time the market. I'm specifically going here to chapter 7, and in the book, I've highlighted a few sections, so you can see I've got some yellow highlights at the bottom of the page. I'm not going to keep you too long, but I do want to share some of the stuff with you, because as we go through time and as circumstances change and the global macroeconomic environment changes, your investment thesis changes as well. But I want to show you some of the things that are sort of applicable here in terms of when you wrote this book, which was in the 80s, compared to what it might look like today. So I'm on chapter 7, which if you have this book or if you order this book, it would be on page 127. He starts off every chapter with a little thing he calls Booneisms, which is kind of cute. He says, Booneism number 18. I might have been born at night, but it wasn't last night, right? Smart guy. Anyway, he writes, total global production is presently at around 85 million barrels per day. A combination of 72 million barrels of black oil, 11 million barrels of natural gas liquids, and another 2 million in refinery process gains and stock liquids, right? So keep that number in mind, 85 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. Now, here's where there's a bit of a sort of separation of his predictions and his comments, which date back, obviously, as I said, to, sort of the 80s, 90s, compared with today. So it's kind of easy for us to keep up with in terms of where we are today. But listen to what he says. Projections are that by 2025, which is now just 2 years away, we'll be using 120 million barrels a day. Well, that's probably quite accurate to a degree anyway, because we are currently using in excess of 100 million barrels per day. Then he continues to say almost twice what we have the capacity to produce. So in other words, 120 million barrels per day 35 years ago was almost twice what we have the capacity to produce. So why is there that separation between what we have the ability to produce and what we were producing at that point in time? We're going to get into that in just a second. He says the peak oil theory was established by Texas-born Shale geophysicist Marion King Hubert. In 1956, he told members of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists, the AAPG, that oil production from conventional sources would peak in the United States by the early 70s, the early 1970s. He also predicted that global oil production would peak in about 50 years. That was in 1956, right? So we would have peaked in or around 2006. He predicted that global oil production would peak in about 50 years, or roughly around 2006. In 1970, domestic production was at an all-time high, 10 million barrels per day. This is in the US, from a domestic US production point of view. Today, when he wrote this, the number is half that amount. So if you have lost track with where I was, he's basically saying 50, 60 years ago, they predicted that we'd be using 120 million barrels of oil per day by 2025, which is possible, right? So that one could come true. But then he continues to say that US oil production peaked in 1970 and domestic production was at an all-time high in 1970. 10 million barrels a day. Today, so 15 years later or so when he wrote the book, that number is half of that amount. So around about the mid-80s or so, the US domestic production was only around 5 million barrels per day. Now, the 2022 EPA average production for the United States was 20 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. So that's just 2 years ago. So where did the delta come from in terms of the production that we were able to secure compared with then and now? Then he predicts starting in 2010, but no later than by 2020 or 2030, according to the latest vision of secular apocalypse, global oil supplies will peak and the world will begin to unravel at the seams. And when the truth can no longer be obscured, the price will spike, the economy will nosedive, and the underpinnings of our civilization will start tumbling like dominoes. This was from the US consumer number one in the lingo of Jeremy Leggett's book, The Empty Tank, Oil, Gas, Hot Air, and the Coming Financial Catastrophe. You wrote that, Jonathan Gatehouse, when oil runs out in Maclean's magazine in 2008. So skipping a page or two, he says, we are going to be dependent on oil for at least another 50 years. He said that in the 80s, right? So we are now sort of on the verge of that 50-year period. That means foreign oil, and that means trouble, right? It's like he didn't know what was coming. And to be fair, neither did anyone else, because he was one of the smartest oil guys at the time. The United States is currently using 21 million barrels of oil a day and producing only 5.5 million barrels of oil per day. The interesting thing there is that the United States is still using or consuming approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day, but we are no longer producing only 5.5 million. Skip another few pages here. Mr. Pickens' book. Go to the next thing. He says, reserve facts are fiction. The Saudis claim, Saudi Arabia claims that they have 260 billion barrels of oil in reserve. I don't believe them. I don't think there's any way they can have that much oil, he writes. Well, the EIA on October the 11th, 2023, so just a couple of months ago, said that Saudi Arabia currently has approximately 298 million barrels of oil in reserve. And that, just by the way, is 221 times its annual consumption. So we're not running out of oil at all. So when they said, or they claimed, they had 260 billion barrels of oil in reserve, in the 80s, Mr. Pickens doubted them, but meanwhile, the EIA just said in October 2023 that they have 298 billion barrels of oil in reserve. The Kuwaiti oil output, he writes, from the second largest field is exhausted and falling after almost 6 decades of pumping, right? So that's the second one, Kuwait. However, on October 2023, as I just said, the EIA said that Kuwait has 7% of global oil in reserves, and they are currently producing approximately 3.15 million barrels of oil per day in production. They have plenty in reserve. How about Iran? In 1986, Iran upped its estimates from about 60 billion barrels to about 90 billion barrels, right? A 50% increase in 1986, they said. We thought we had 60, we actually have about 90 billion barrels. However, as recently as 2016, the EIA estimated Iran has approximately 157.5 billion barrels of oil in reserve. I'm not sharing this with you to diss T. Boone Pickens. In fact, he's one of the people that I regard as one of the most knowledgeable oil experts of his day. Another production company, he writes, thinking creatively and getting good results is Denbury. Now, Denbury is a company you may not be familiar with, but they were just acquired as recently as July 23, so just a few months ago by ExxonMobil. But here's the interesting thing, right? In the 80s, Denbury was injecting CO2 into depleted oil fields to enhance production. Denbury also owns the Jackson Dome in Mississippi, which has an estimated 13 trillion cubic feet of CO2. So carbon capture, direct air capture, and all those things that some companies are claiming ownership of, including Occidental Petroleum, comes from a long way back. In the 1980s, the major oil companies invested billions to attempt to produce oil from shale. And this is the part of the book where I'm sharing with you where the delta in terms of what he thought was peak production and where we are today came from. In the 80s, US oil companies invested billions to attempt to produce oil from shale. When the price of oil collapsed in 1985, they walked away from these projects. I've seen estimates, says T. Boone Pickens, that US oil shale reserves could contain 1.5 trillion barrels of oil, 5 times the stated reserves of Saudi Arabia at the time. I hope this turns out to be true. I don't know much about oil shale, except that I'll be long gone before they produce oil from shale in any meaningful amount. When he wrote this, he didn't know that by the time of his passing, which was on September the 11th, 2019 in Dallas, Texas, that the US Bureau of Land Management estimated that the United States has approximately 2.175 trillion barrels of recoverable oil. And that Permian patch that he mentioned there was producing in 2019 12.3 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. It's a great book. If you buy this book, T. Boone Pickens, The First Billion is the Hardest, you'll find it a very entertaining read. You could probably finish it over a weekend or even perhaps on a Saturday if you're inclined to read and enjoy things like this. Of course, it's easy to look back and think to yourself like, man, I'm so smart, right? I know all these things that T. Boone Pickens, the great oil genius who traded futures in the 80s, did not know. However, he was ahead of his time in many respects, and he's one of the smartest guys who ever traded oil futures and oil stocks and made a lot of money as a result. In fact, he made several $100 million of his fortune trading oil. Now, the critical point there is, as I said right at the beginning, time in the market is much better than time trying to time the market. So what you want to do is find the undervalued stocks based on your own due diligence that you might be willing to invest your money into, and just leave it there, because over time, most of these predictions, including the doom and gloom projections of the climate change prophets who tell us that the world is going to end anytime soon. I mean, we've already passed several of the benchmarks. Al Gore started out in the 80s by telling people that the ice caps were going to melt. Well, that didn't happen. Then there was going to be ice rain. There was going to be a hole in the ozone layer. They just keep coming at you with doom and gloom predictions. Find your undervalued stock, and then you can just buy it, hold it. And like I've said many times in previous videos before, if you don't know what to buy, you can always invest in energy. It's relatively safe, right? Nothing is safe as an investment. But if you buy an energy ETF, if you're not keen on doing your own due diligence, buy something like XLE, and 20% of it is Exxon, 20% of it is Chevron, and the other 60% are some really, really great blue chip, mid-cap and large cap energy companies in the United States. It's an easy buy if you can pick it up. XLE, you can just hold it and almost forget about it, and you'll be okay. So on that happy note, get yourself a copy of T. Boone Pickens' book, The First Billion is the Hardest. Enjoy, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.